Every faction in Warhammer 3 has those units that just plain suck. Whether they have a stat card so bad that recruiting them is actively choosing to play on hard mode, or if they're made obsolete by other units in the same tier. These are the very worst units for every faction in Total War Warhammer 3. Starting with the Beastmen, and I have the Ungor Raiders. Right off the bat, the Beastmen have a very solid roster, but for me, the Ungor Raiders just never really fit in. The entire playstyle of non-stop momentum that encapsulates the Beastmen experience doesn't really pair well with very weak ranged units without a lot of range. I can accept the Cygor since it does huge area damage from a huge range, so it can soften enemies up whilst the rest of the army advances, but these just don't have a place. I would much rather just take more melee units and swarm the enemy that way than have something sitting back peppering the enemy with moderately pointy sticks. The one situation where they're viable is if you're battling against some large threats like trolls or giants, but chances of that happening in the early game are pretty slim, so in most cases just stick with melee troops. Yes, I know they're free, but so are low tier melee troops and I'd rather have those. And like I said, the Beastmen roster is really strong, so this is honestly a unit that I feel brings the least potential. Coming to Bretonnia with the Grail Reliquy, still not entirely sure how to pronounce that one. I mean, surely this one is an easy pick. I used to think the auras it brought were okay, but honestly taking another look at them, they're just worthless. So first of all, their stat card and combat capabilities. They have none. Awful melee stats in a clunky hitbox mean they die in an instant and do no real damage to anything. Frenzy and damage resist are good things to have on a better unit, but here they're like putting icing on a dog turd and calling it a cake. The aura is really the only value it brings if you're avoiding combat, and what can I say? 8 leadership and 5 attack is nice and all, but they're going to be on the front lines where you primarily use chaff to make an anvil for your cav to hammer, so you're buffing units that are literally there to be a meat shield. If you are using sustained combat cav, then maybe I can see the value, but even then you're better off just bringing another cav unit, artillery, a hero, or basically anything else. Sadly, as fun as this one is to look at, it has no place on the battlefield. For the Chaos Dwarves, I'm picking the Dreadquake Mortar. Oh, I bet you're typing up a storm over this one. Something to the effect of,
I'll have you know the Dreadquake is one of the best units in the faction, nay, in the game.
And all I have to say to you is, you're right, the Dreadquake is good, but it could be better. And it can be better with just one word. Trains. Yes, why would you have a regular Dreadquake when you can have a Dreadquake being pulled by a train? Not only do you maintain all of the power of the Dreadquake, you now also have much improved movement speed to keep it out of harm's way. Plus, if you run out of ammo or can't get off safe shots, you can charge in or use some other ranged power. It doesn't matter if you're Team Iron Demon or Team Skullcracker, both are better than a standard Dreadquake Mortar. You unlock them at the same time in the building tree, and even though the train versions are more expensive, at that stage of the game, does it really matter? If you ask me, there is no reason to ever pick these standard Dreadquake over the train versions, as they are quite literally the same unit, but better. For the Daemons of Chaos, I'm going with Chaos Furies, and more specifically, I'm talking the basic no affiliation Chaos Furies, and it's exactly for that reason. You're playing as a faction that can easily get access to all 5 flavors of Chaos Fury, so why would you ever go for the basic unflavored option? Literally all the other options are more or less the same unit, but bring extra bonus value. Khorne has Frenzy, Nurgle has Poison, Slaanesh has Devastating Flanker, and Tzeentch has the Barrier. These guys are just pointless. Sure, it may be nice to get the full Rainbow Furies in a single army, but if you're playing to win battles, I can see an argument for taking every single type of Fury, but this one. For the Dark Elves, I'm going for the Dual Weapons Shades, and this is yet another case of a fairly solid roster, but one unit is just the littlest bit pointless. You may remember that Greatsword Shades were the best unit in the roster, so you may be wondering what makes dual weapons the worst. Well, to simply put it, they ain't him, Chief. They unlock at the same building as Greatswords, so there is zero reason you should ever choose them. The range damage may be identical, but in melee they have less defense and armor piercing damage, so if they get caught in melee, they'll be worse at keeping themselves alive, and will do less damage. So literally, what is the point? And yeah, I know, they're meant to be used against less armored targets, and whilst that is true, it really doesn't make a difference. Unless the enemy has 0 armor, that extra melee attack won't make a difference with the severe drop in armor piercing damage. Just go great swords every time and never bother with these guys. If you want something cheaper and don't want to think about melee, use regular shades. If you want the best, go great swords. Simple as that. For the Dowie, the Dwarves, the Short Lads, we're going the Bolt Thrower. Another that I doubt many people will have a problem with because this thing, it just plain stings. I don't know if it's just me, but this thing is painfully inaccurate, meaning if you're aiming for anything other than a stationary giant, they're going to struggle. Honestly, everything else about it is fine. High range and decent damage for something so early, but it never lands a shot, so nothing else really matters. If you want something to deal with large targets, then use Quarrelers or Thunderers that unlock at the same building tier. Hell, if you want something with long range, just use the Grudge Thrower. chances are it'll do more damage to large targets even with the improper projectiles. This is one of those units I avoid at all costs because it is simply a trap. You see it and think, yeah, I could use something for the occasional large target, but no, don't fall for this thing. It stinks. You're better off with basically anything else you can recruit at the same tier. For the Empire, we have the War Wagons, yet another shoe-in for the worst unit list, and it likely always will be. The War Wagon is just kind of a bad idea for a unit. In theory, they're meant to be like ranged chariots you ride around the map to fire into the flanks of enemies. In reality, they're slow, clunky crates on wheels that are easily chased and pinned down by anything moderately fast. Sure, they may have high armor, but awful melee stats negate that entirely. Besides, once they're pinned, they're dead, as they're not fighting their way out or escaping with those clunky giant hitboxes. If you want something to move around to enemy flanks and shoot them in the back, use Outriders, with or without grenades, and get the same experience. Sure, they may need a little bit of micro to keep them from being pinned down, but it's still far less work than the War Wagons. Plus, they can actually outrun most things that chase them down. Don't ever be fooled by the missile stat, it's straight up lying to your face because it doesn't take into account that they'll die before they get even close to half of that. For Grand Cathay, we have the Wu Jing War Compass, and this is a unit that has never really made any sense to me. To get the stat card out of the way, yes, it's worthless in combat, so the value you're getting is from its abilities. Whilst they're okay, they're hardly enough to justify its existence. 2 decent spells and some slight buffs to your army's magical power is great and all, but can I point out one crucial error? You can literally get an Astromancer hero on one of these and literally get the exact same value as well as a full Law of Magic. Technically, you miss out on the Yang Harmony, but aside from that, it's the exact same, but better. I see no reason to ever bring one of these with you into combat unless you're doing some sort of meme comp where you just run mages and need to fill out your other slots. Bring literally any other unit in the roster and they will bring you more value. For the Greenskins, we have the Giant. My hatred of the Giant runs deeper than all the oceans of the world put together. No matter how many times they change them and people claim they're better, I will stand firm that they are one of the worst units you can put in an army. Until they're given a golden shield, I will stand by them being absolutely god-awful because they're easily countered by even the weakest ranged units in the game. They're impossible to miss unless using a bolt thrower, of course. They have pretty low armor and a tiny amount of missile resist. Literally, just focus fire them and they go down in seconds, especially in the late game, which is when they're unlocked. Now yes, if you're not going against a faction with a lot of ranged power, they can be great on the front lines, but the moment the enemy works out how to throw rocks, it all comes crumbling down. I do not understand why anyone would pick a giant when you can go with the Ragnarok Spider, which yes, is still large but has a ton of armor, a shorter hitbox, and brings a lot more value with poison. Hell, I'd take a Colossal Squig over giants at this point. Just avoid any and all giants, they all suck. To keep things interesting, this will be the only giant on the list, hence why I didn't mention it for the Beastmen, but just know any faction that has one, don't use it. It's terrible. For the High Elves, we have the Silver Helms, and this one could not be simpler. Silver Helms are fine, but the same building tier, you unlock Silver Helms with shields. Pick those every time, and that's really all I have to say. I mean, for ad revenue purposes, I'll flesh it out a little bit more, but honestly, I could leave it there. Shields bring them more defense from melee and missiles, keeping them healthier for longer. Yes, they are a shot cav, so won't be doing much sitting around and battling, but even when charging, they can take a few hits, and shields mean they take a few less. The cost difference is minimal, and you're playing as the High Elves, so that hardly matters anyway. I just can't see any single reason to not go shields, so literally pretend this unshielded variant doesn't exist, because it might as well. For Khorne, we have the Spawn of Khorne, and they are another faction with a very solid roster, and similar to the Beastmen, it's all about relentless aggression. The one unit that I personally feel is a little bit out of place is the Spawn of Khorne. Most Chaos Spawn are a little bit mid with the low armor piercing and defenses, making them into unbreakable berserkers that tend to burn bright but very quickly. The main problem is they unlock at the same time as Blood Beasts of Khorne, which are straight up better in every way. The one thing Chaos Spawn have over them is unbreakable, and honestly, all that really means is they get wiped out when they could have just run away. This isn't really a case of a bad unit. They're honestly fine for a mid-game monster. They're just not good enough to pull through to the late game and are easily replaced by something you unlock at the exact same time in the exact same building. For Kislev, I'm going Kosovo Dervishes. This one is pretty close to my heart because I absolutely despise these units. They are just total hot garbage, no good, worthless, very bad units. Here's everything they are good at. Going fast. And now for the bad. Awful melee stats for both attack and defense, so they do both no damage and take loads of it. Awful weapon strength means they cannot punch through armor beyond enemies wrapping themselves in tinfoil. Poor charge bonus and no mass, so they can have a huge run up only to land like a light breeze. I would honestly rather have no cav early on than have these guys. They are just terrible. Plus, in the early game of every single Kislev campaign, aside from Mama Stanky and Nagrond, you are battling against factions that don't really use a lot of ranged units. I'm talking Chaos and Norsca. What is the point of having cav that can only take on weak ranged units if you're not battling against them? Never use these, as they are worthless and I hate them. Coming to the Lizardmen now, and we have the Cold One Spear Riders, and this is more Cathay, I promise. First of all, feral cold ones are worse if we're counting every unit in the roster, but they only appear via an army ability, so don't count. Both Cold One Riders suck, with low melee and charge stats making them bad at both jobs that Cav could have. Normally swapping to spears increases charge, but instead you drop attack and damage to get bonus versus large. Now let me point out to you what's bad about this. Everything. Normally, when you give anti-large to Cav, it's so they can become Cav or other large target hunters. Think Demigryph Halberds with their ability to battle other Cav or monsters. However, their pathetic melee stats means they can't fight their way out of a paper bag. Well, maybe they're charging the backs of monsters on the front lines. Wrong again, because the slow speed and pathetic charge bonus mean they land with all the impact of a loosely packed snowball. So it begs the question, what exactly do you use these guys for? And the answer is, I don't know. They're just not good at anything, so I can't find a place for them in any army. Maybe, if you stack a bunch of Lord skills and XP levels, you can make them work, but baseline, as they are, raw dog, they're awful. Honestly, I think all Lizardmen Cav, apart from Ripperdactyls, are terrible. Just use some monsters for a much better experience. For Norsca, I'm going with the Poison Warhounds. Now, I really wanted to pick the regular Warhounds. The Poison variants are exactly the same, but come with Poison, so are just better. You see, the problem is, they are literally unrecruitable in my game. I don't know if this is something just borked for me, but in the campaign, they do not appear anywhere in any building, so are literally unusable. Okay, new conspiracy theory for you all. I swear, every patch that goes by, CA are slowly removing more of Norsca in the hopes that they can one day remove the entire faction and no one will notice. So yes, my serious answer is regular Warhounds, but in the interest of drawing attention to this, I'm gonna go with Poison. This is yet another pick that applies to any faction that can use both regular and Poison Warhounds, so if you don't see me mention them again for Warriors of Chaos, you know why. Poison are better. Speaking of poison, Nurgle, and I'm going with the Pestigors. The Nurgle roster is a little hard to gauge what's worth picking up at different stages due to their whole cyclical buildings gimmick. However, I find the Pestigors are never really worth using as they unlock after Plague Bearers and have worse stats nearly across the board. Technically they're faster, so if you're doing a speedy Nurgle army, then I suppose they're an okay pick. But who is running some kind of rush comp with Nurgle, the faction all about slow creeping death draining the life from enemies? Besides, ignoring the comparison, they're just not all that good. Sure, they have armor piercing, but they also have very low melee stats and armor, so will likely die before you can make the most of it. If you want armor piercing, you're better off using Marauders with great weapons, so there truly is 0 point to using the Pestigors. Coming now to the Ogre Kingdoms, and I have the regular bog standard Stonehorn. Yet another roster where they have no terrible units, but I think I can make a case for the regular Stonehorn being a little bit skippable. Now, it's not a bad unit by any means. It's a very powerful frontlines monster, with the only major downside being the excruciatingly large hitbox. But the reason it's making the list is that the Harpoon variant is literally the exact same, but now has artillery grade missile power. Yes, it is unlocked a tier later, and yes, it's more expensive, but if I was building an endgame army for the Ogre Kingdoms, I would likely skip the regular Stonehorn and just bring a bunch of Harpoons. It can do all the same great battling in melee if that's what you need, or it can sit at the back and deal devastating damage from a safe distance. Whatever you need in your battles, it can do it, so there's literally no reason to bother with the regular Stonehorn once the Harpoon is unlocked. Like I said, not a bad unit, just one that doesn't really have a place in an endgame army. For the Skaven, I'm going with the regular, bog standard, you know, you love them, the Clan Rats. The low end of the Skaven front line has no shortage of crappy units, but that is kind of the entire point. They're only there to be a meat shield, so it doesn't really matter what their stats are. So why are the standard Clan Rats the worst unit in the roster? Well, they just don't make any sense to pick at literally any time. If you want a line holder with some better defensive stats, you should just go spears, or even shields. However, if you want the cheapest units, then you just go with the Slaven Skaves. Basic Clan Rats are literally pointless because there is no time in the game when it makes sense to take them. Again, I can't really dwell on the stat card because they're meant to be bad. This one just comes down to other options rather than anything specific about the unit itself. Coming to the sultry land of Slaanesh, we have the Spear Marauders. Similar to the Skaven, early game Slaanesh front lines are only really there to be a meat shield. All the damage in the army is going to come from various charging units, be they infantry, cav, or even monsters. So for that job, you want the most defense you can get, and sadly, spears aren't it. Hell Scourges are drastically better at both attack and defense, so the clear winner when it comes to line holders. Yes, they need a tier 2 building, but even if they're not an option, you may as well go with regular Marauders as you're missing out on basically nothing and having a teeny bit more damage being put out. Yet another case of a unit simply not having a place in armies. It simply never makes sense to take them, so I never would. For the Tomb Kings, we have the Carrion. The way the Tomb King roster works with their recruitment capacities makes their units a little bit more unique to rank. In theory, this would make them harder to sort through, but thankfully a unit exists that is so catastrophically bad that it will always be the worst unit in the Tomb Kings and probably one of the worst in the game. At first glance, the stat card looks okay, but once you give it a close look, they are just terrible. 46 defense seems crazy until you realize their minuscule health and armor, alongside the fact they are so easily surrounded in melee, it's not even funny. 0 charge bonus, so will land with all the impact of a drop of rain, weak, non-armor piercing damage, and awful attack. But by far, the worst stat is 35 leadership. All that means is the moment they land in combat against anything that can't beat, also known as literally anything because that stat card is trash, they will lose all confidence and fall to pieces in seconds. They are truly awful, never ever use them, and you will always be better off. For Tzeentch, we have the Screamers, from one awful flying unit to another. I always feel like there's something I'm missing with Screamers because they look cool and are pretty iconic of a unit for Tzeentch. However, anytime I try to use them in battle, I'm reminded why I always avoid them. The stat card is just anus. 20% physical resist plus 30 armor is moderate defense at best and terrible versus magical damage. 22 melee defense is extremely low, especially considering their large awkward hitboxes. 26 attack also isn't great, so even with their respectable armor piercing damage, they're hardly going to land a hit. Well, maybe they're good at charging with their very low charge bonus. I just don't get what you're supposed to do with them because they are just straight up bad at everything. Add on the fact that they have pretty low leadership and are demonic, and they'll be disintegrating moments after the start of battle. All I have to say is Screamer, more like Steamer. Coming now to the Vampire Coast, and I'm going to go, as usual, with the Depth Guard. I've never understood the point of the regular Depth Guard. In a faction so focused on gunpowder and explosive power, mixed with cool aquatic monsters, why do we have some anti-chaff front lines for the end game? If they were a mid game, I'd understand, but they're not. These are late game units. I seriously don't see a scenario where I would take them over literally anything else in the roster. If I want a defensive front line, I'll go polearms with better defense plus armor piercing damage and charge reflection. If I want a meat shield, I'll go with some cheaper zombies. If I want to kill chaff, I will literally shoot them with any of the ranged options in the faction. Personally, I abandon all melee infantry altogether and stick to infinite powder, so I will literally never use them. And the worst part is, they're not even a bad unit. They do great non-armor piercing anti-infantry damage and have a shockingly high attack. The armor is great, and with Frenzy and the Hunger, they can put in some serious work. Sadly, it's work I don't and you don't need them for. It's like hiring a plumber when you live with Bob the Builder. That fella is going to get the job done just fine. You don't need these guys. Coming now to my beloved, the Vampire Counts, next to get a rework absolutely confirmed, and I of course have the basic Corpse Cart. And it falls into the same category of a unit where it makes zero, I repeat, 0 sense to ever use it. It does not contribute to combat, but to be fair, none of the Corpse Carts do. However, the other two also bring powerful auras to boost your other troops, and the base version brings a very small boost to melee and vigor. Now I know what you're thinking, 5 of each melee stat isn't nothing, and I agree with you. However, if we take a look at the other Corpse Carts, you'll notice they have this same aura on top of everything else they bring. Again, they do need a higher building tier, but they are well worth waiting for. I would rather take a unit of zombies than the basic Corpse Cart, as it simply does not justify its existence in my armies. If you really want a Corpse Cart early, just get a Necromancer in your armies, then immediately swap it out for a better one once they level up. As for the base unit as it is right now, it's worthless. For the Warriors of Chaos, I'm going to have to go with the Marauder Horsemasters. I've never really understood the point of this unit, even way back to Warhammer 1. Compared to the other variants, the only real advantage is on the melee side of things, and even then they're still worthless, so it's not like it's making any difference. Sure, they have more range, but their armor piercing damage is 1 more than regular horsemen and 13 less than throwing axes. For a unit you're supposed to use later in the game, I just don't see how they could justify their existence. If you're going against low armor, I guess they're better, but what are the chances of that in the late game? You are far better off with throwing axes for more armor piercing, or some melee cav with monsters if you're desperate to have something to use in melee. I just do not see the point of this unit in any possible situation. Unless you're riding against Volkmar and his army of unarmored flagellants, then take literally anything else. And closing us out as usual, we have the Wood Elves, and I'm going to go with the Wild Wood Rangers. The Wood Elves are another faction with an extremely solid roster in pretty much every category. However, the one unit I find to be pretty pointless is the Wild Wood Rangers. Now I want to be clear, they're really not that bad. However, compared to other units you unlock at the same time or even earlier, they don't justify being picked, and here's why. Unless they go against a terror-causing unit, this stat card is all you get, and they don't get much better as the fight goes on. For both the War Dancers and the Blade Singers, they can use toggleable abilities to move around their stats to become much more defensive. This makes them into much better line holders should you need that. But even if you don't, the Blade Singers are simply a better unit with more melee stats and the exact same damage. Like I said, they're not bad, but I would just never pick them since other options are flat out better. But that's my list. Let me know in the comments below what you think are the worst units for every single faction in Total War Warhammer 3. Like, subscribe, and if you want more Warhammer 3 list videos, then check out this one for the best units for every single faction in the game.